Hello and welcome everyone to, I believe, our 6th HWISE Now virtual coffee hour. We're really pleased to have all of you, and I'm seeing the attendees jump in, as well as, of course, our panelists to join us today. For the past several months, actually, since I believe, September, January, February, we've been really convening these HY Now episodes, and they've really been very successful. So I want to thank all of you for joining us, supporting us. And we're still, booking all the way into 2022. So we're going to continue this even, hopefully, fingers crossed, in a post-pandemic world, although we have our ups and downs, as we all know, with Delta. So hopefully all of you are safe, but we will continue doing this. It's been a great way to continue building community in different ways. So thank you so much. For those of you who are new to HWISE, I'd like to introduce myself. So I'm Wendy Jepson, University Professor of Geography at Texas A&M University. I have several roles. I'm the Associate Director for the Texas Water Resources Institute here in Texas, but I also lead the Household Water Insecurity Experiences Research Coordination Network, HWISE, as we say, and have been doing this for several years. This is an NSF-supported RCN, and what we've tried to do over the past several years is build a community of practice that fosters analytics and theoretical advances around issues related to water insecurity at the household scale. My own research examines dimensions of unjust and inequitable water systems and institutions, with really an eye towards the causes of water injustice from a political economic perspective. And so it's been a great pleasure to work with a whole host of folks from across disciplines, physical science, social science, and within the social sciences in this endeavor that we call HWISE. In addition, just to let everyone know, we will be recording or are recording this event and hosting it on our YouTube site after the talk. So we'll be happy to keep that information to you as well. So as people join, or if they only can attend for part of it, we'll have the whole conversation online. So I first want to give some orientation towards not only our guests here, our participants, but our attendees. So as I mentioned, we are going to have informal discussion. So if you have questions, those of you who are attending, please feel free to put your questions in the chat or the Q&A box. I'll be facilitating that as we move through our conversation. But again, the whole idea is to be informal, to keep this a conversational flow. And so hopefully I'll be able to facilitate engagement of our attendees with our panelists. But one more thing before we start, I'm going to do my pitch now. I'm really happy to announce that HWISE has opened up a new call for proposals for what we call HWISE Collaborator Accelerator Award. And so the intent of this program is to bring small teams of researchers together to accelerate new theoretical, methodological, analytical, outreach, or even educational collaborations related to household water insecurity. So it is an award of $1,000 to $2,000 towards travel or other scholarly creative activities. So if you're interested, or if there's a group of you who've had an idea that you need to consolidate, and this might be a good infusion of time and resources, please check out our webpage under the project menu, and all the instructions for applications for that are available as well. So applications are due September 15th, but we really want to encourage early career scholars, new teams to be really creative with this resource, and we're excited to hear what people have to offer. So that was my little pitch, so sorry, but I wanted to do that for everybody as we have some attendees that may not have heard yet. So HWISE does a lot of different things. This is one of them, as well as our Accelerator Award. So with that, we're going to get to the real topic today, which is thinking about household water insecurity in times of climate disruption. And it's a real pleasure that I have to see Amanda Fencl, Mullin, and Farhana Sultana to join us today. People who I have admired for many years in terms of their scholarship. Amanda is a new recent postdoc and moving on to fellowship at AAAS. And her work, again, if any of you have not seen it, really addresses these issues centrally. And so this is a great group of scholars to tackle these challenging questions. Amanda and Megan have examined drought, Farhana's work in South Asia cuts across both disasters that are both disruptions, but also more slow socio-ecological disruptions for vulnerable communities in South Asia. So climate disruptions are not necessarily punctuated disasters. They can be slow onset. And as we see these fundamental temporalities of socio-ecological change and shifts are also in their own way disruptive. They move from being seasonal to constant, reducing capacity for recovery in that in-between space. And so we're seeing this acceleration not only in the kinds of climate disruptions, but this temporality, I think, that becomes so disruptive as well. So I wanted to allow for our groups here to introduce themselves and then start with some questions and conversation. So I'm going to look to Amanda. If you could introduce yourself, let us know about your research and how your scholarship examines the intersection of household water insecurity and climate disruption.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's an honor to be here. I've admired Farhana and Megan and Wendy's work for years, so it's super exciting to be sort of the early career scholar representative here. As Wendy mentioned, I'm a postdoc here at A&M. I started in fall 2019, and our project is really looking at sustainable transitions in urban water sector, focusing on desal and reuse. So how do these advanced water technologies contribute or not to sustainability, to water justice, to water security? And as Wendy mentioned, I'm starting a AAAS fellowship as a climate change fellow with the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which, if you don't know, it's a bilateral aid and poverty alleviation focused part of the government. And I'm helping them operationalize and implement their new climate change strategy. And so this conversation is both interesting for my current work, but also as I look to the future, as I flip back from more domestic stuff to California. There was my background, and how I identify as a scholar, I realized I've been thinking about climate change adaptation for almost 15 years, like ever since I graduated college and was a researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute. But clearly what that means and how I approach it has shifted as I've gone back to get my PhD, as I've thought a lot about justice issues and intersectionality, and what does it mean to have a marginalized identity, to be a vulnerable community, and not to constantly be sort of projecting what they should do, but be listening from the community-led solutions to think through what does that adaptive capacity mean for them. And I think because I'm now an environmental geographer and how I understand climate change and water disruptions, part of that is also a multiple method. As a social scientist, I do surveys, I do semi-structured interviews, I do participant observation, and more recently I've been doing a lot of community-based participatory research. And I think that at the core of any time you're talking about climate disruption, water security, it's really looking to the first impacted, the most marginalized and vulnerable, to make sure that they are their needs and their concerns are being addressed. And as Wendy mentioned, because I did my graduate work in California during the last drought. Now they're in another really serious drought. A lot of my work in the last 8 or 10 years have been really focused on drought and fire and the intersection of these climate hazards and what does it mean for urban water security now. But in California, a lot of that was the small rural community water systems, and then self-supplying households. And I'll get into this later on in some of the prompts, but those are usually the ones that are first to run out of water, the first impacted by some of the climate hazards. And if you look at the documentation, we know this, we anticipate it, we talk about it, and we kind of just let it happen. So that is partly why climate justice has now become so core to what I'm looking at in terms of what can the state do, what can local actors do to really address some of these water justice issues as we go into a more disruptive climate future. And so I just want to close quickly by saying that a lot of the things that I think about and understand wouldn't be possible without a lot of the work of the community organizers, of the water justice organizations that fight at both like Sacramento political level for policy change to hold certain bad actors accountable, but also for material change to make sure that these households that are on the front line to climate impacts are having their basic human rights addressed and met through the policy and actually giving water to those households. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass the mic to others.
Thank you, Amanda. Megan, would you like to introduce yourselves and your work as it relates to household water insecurity and climate disruption?
Sure. Again, I'll echo Amanda in thanking you, Wendy and Lauren, for putting this together. And it's a pleasure to be here with people whose work I admire so much. I'm a political scientist, and my work overall really looks at the intersection between environmental conditions and political decision making. And when I study water, my emphasis is really on how water provision is situated within systems, mostly of formal governmental authority, and the capacity of those systems to respond to environmental conditions and really to changing climatic conditions, right? That affect water supply, that affect water use, that affect water allocations, and feelings of water security. And my work is situated in the United States, and some of this is just a product of how political science is organized as a discipline. American politics is sort of separated from what we call comparative politics in the US political science, which is politics everywhere else. But then as I immersed myself in the study of water, right, I became a scholar of water organization in the United States, which is tens of thousands of governments and non-governmental organizations providing water at the local level. And that's a lot of different formal government organizations to master. And Amanda knows this well, having tried to code many of these herself. And so my work looks at kind of the formal authority that governs household water services. And so I end up really being more a student of community water security more than household water security, because in the United States, drinking water is mostly, by and large, provided at the community level, although with really important exceptions. Another sort of, a background condition in the United States that's becoming more and more kind of prevalent in my work, right, is the growing segregation, economic and racial segregation between political jurisdictions in the United States. And when we have water governance that's so situated at the local level and financed at the local level, what that means in terms of exposure to water-related risks and capacity to address those risks, right? The capacity to reduce those risks. And so I ask questions about the responsiveness of water governance to climate disruptions, the capacity, right, of water systems to respond to those disruptions, who benefits and who pays for responsiveness. And that mostly has come through in drinking water, although increasingly I've been looking at wastewater and also starting to look at sort of flood-related risks and other water-related risks in the United States. I sit at Duke. As I said, I'm a political scientist, but I sit in the environment school at Duke. But I'm joining you today from Big Bear Lake, which is in Southern California, a small town up at 7,000 feet in the San Bernardino Mountains of Southern California, and has a really interesting water story. It's very much on the front line of climate-related water risk, and they're trying to take on a big project to improve their water security. And I think I'll talk about that a little bit later in the conversation.
Thank you so much, Megan. And it's really a pleasure to have Farhana here, who aptly wrote, and I recently read this, climate change is largely about water change. I love it. It really kind of captures why this is intersection is appropriate for us to sort of engage in at different scales, and the cascading relationships between community water, as Megan said, and household water security. So Farhana, I'm going to hand over the mic to you. Could you introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. Thanks so much, Wendy, for organizing this and the generous work that HWISE has been doing for today's discussion. And hello and welcome, everyone. So I'm a faculty member in the Department of Geography and the Environment at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University, which is in upstate New York. I'm also here, the research director for environment in the program for the Advancement of Research in Collaboration and Conflicts, which is PARC, PARCC, at Syracuse University. And affiliation-wise, I guess I should throw in, I'm a steering committee member of HWISE, the network that brings you this today. So as Wendy mentioned, I've been working on issues around water insecurity and water injustices, especially in relation to climate breakdown and climate justice for, gosh, I'm going to carbon date myself, for about 25 years. So pretty much, my entire adult life, all the way through college, graduate school, thereafter, and so on. This is primarily because, as Wendy just pointed out, and I've said this so many times and written it, I think, for some time, but it's only caught a lot of traction recently, is that climate change is water change. It's effectively too much water, too little water, wrong timing, wrong place, wrong frequency, right? Or right frequency. So all of these water-related hazards that combine with human interventions and unequal power relations and unjust histories create the uneven terrains of disasters and injustices that I've been looking at for a very long time. Because my experience has been that climate change impacts societies largely through water, which is why I've been focusing on issues around climate-water nexus and the ongoing implications of this for societies, their politics, various socio-ecologies, and policy making at different scales, local, state, and international. On the water governance front, I've worked on issues around urban and rural water scarcities and supply, on issues around the human rights to water and sanitation, and on transboundary water concerns. Additionally, on the climate side, I've worked more specifically on what critical climate justice means, and then what international solidarities look like to address climate colonialism and racial capitalism, because all of those issues factor into the ways that hydrosocial cycles are altered and thereby impact people. So one of my ongoing projects looks at urban climate justice issues across Asia. So ultimately, all of my research, the entire time I've been, as a scholar, is looking at how vulnerabilized communities are made vulnerable. And then what are the institutions involved, whether it's various types of water crises or ongoing climate breakdowns, however that manifests. And then how do we address these that are both evolving, new, and then also longstanding challenges. So what I do, in terms of my kind of research politics, I think I try to bring in a very interdisciplinary framing because I draw from my background and training in the natural sciences and the critical social sciences, and also my policy experience when I worked for the UN before academia. I bring those together to investigate and try to understand in more complex ways what scalar justice means when we have these complex challenges. And what really, I think, at least in my work, makes sense to me is that I engage both scholarly insight, and material from policy and empirical documents, but my work is also very much influenced and informed by my situated knowledge as a scholar of and from the Global South. So I draw insights from my own lived experience in South Asia, which is where I work, and I work through existing scholarship to look at kind of transnational types of scholarly work, but then also local embodied knowledges that are often ignored. So what I try to do, at least in my teaching, whether it's in my pedagogy and my research and my writing, is not just to present myself as like, okay, I'm the geographer who looks at nature society dialectics internationally and intersectionally, or as a feminist geographer or a political ecologist or a development scholar, but to integrate all of those scholarly insights and empirical or research findings, but then to recognize that how this is also a great privilege, but then it's also a responsibility when somebody like me has roots in spaces of ongoing water crises and climate injustices. And I grew up with water crises and climate injustices in places that have been experiencing these for many, many decades. So one of the things that is more specific to this webinar today is that because a lot of the climate-related impacts are manifesting viscerally through water scarcity and drinking water in the household level, my work has really focused on that for many years in terms of looking at what is water, drinking water availability, mean or reliability, quality, quantity, accessibility, timing, and how does that relate to not just governance structures and institutions, but ongoing wider ecological and climate factors. So one of the things that I've talked about for some time is that how, climate change shows up in different types of gradual or slow disasters like salinity increase, sea level rise, drought, desertification. So again, these are instances of different types of water, different spatialities and temporalities. But then also, in addition to the slow onset disasters, are the dramatic incidences, such as floods, flash floods, storms, tsunamis, riverbank erosion. So both types of water-related and climate-related disasters exacerbate daily household water needs. So in my empirical work, I've really focused on issues around climate disruptions in terms of areas that face drinking water shortages. So the IPCC determined many years ago, I think about 20 years ago, that South Asia would face freshwater shortages, even though it's a monsoonal climate, so you expect a lot of rainfall. But issues such as rainfall have been erratic, the seasonality has changed. We've also dealing with sea surges and flash floods and river shifting. So there's that slow and fast disasters that are occurring in these uneven ways. And I've been looking at issues around that intimate relationship between societies and water through which the implications of climate are being felt. Epistemologically, and I'll just conclude with this by way of introduction, is that my work is definitely influenced by, feminist, post-colonial, decolonial, and anti-racist scholarship. But in terms of drawing more specifically from transnational feminist insights, a lot of my work for all these years has really been looking at intersectional gendered impacts of the outcomes of water-related climate hazards. So spatial intersectionality, which is looking at it not just within societies, but across societies, helps frame a lot of my work on water and climate. And I can go into a little bit more in terms of why this is important, because I think what happens is when we're talking about households and communities, we don't recognize that there are various interlocking axes of oppression that occur in every society, whether it's by gender and class, race, ability, migrant status, religion, or disability, and so on. So when we think about these kinds of crises, how are they experienced and how do they manifest differently? So this is where intersectionality as a framework becomes important, or spatial intersectionality, but then also thinking about how these are related to wider issues and why we should care. Because, if we think about it in very kind of policy language, it's a value added because it necessitates that disaggregation of data and gets behind the data. So it's not just an explanatory tool, but it helps formulate policies and projects so that we don't reproduce various marginalizations and oppressions in terms of figuring out what climate adaptation or water governance should mean. And therefore, we always have to understand local contexts and complexities more closely and ask questions about who's involved, where, with what means and why. And I'm happy to elaborate more on this further in our conversation.
Well, in a sense, Farhana, what you just sort of ended on is a nice segue into sort of the next question that I want to present to the group, is really around what you all see as the most pressing issue around water insecurity and climate disruptions that are not commonly addressed in science or policy. So I think that each one of you has worked in the policy realm, thinking about ways in which institutional responses to climate change impact water with water institutions, especially in the US with Megan and Amanda, policies in terms of water provisioning, around drought, some of these climate disruptions, which I think first come to mind. I call them first order disruptions, right? The droughts or the climatic changes explicitly. But there are other ways in which, as you articulated, ways of constructing what is a climate disruption. So with that in mind, I want to see what you all perceive and understand as issues that are not really addressed yet in some of the climate, in some of the science and policy responses going forward. So with that, I'm doing a rotation on my screen here. So I'm going to look to Megan if she wants to jump in on this.
Sure, and I think Farhana ended on my jumping off point, right? Which is this intersection between, right, the data we have, right, is clearly embedding assumptions about what's important, about what we need to measure, about who we're measuring for, you know, who is getting measured, right? Whose water accessibility and whose water quality matters. And that's very much reflected in the United States. And so in the United States, we at the federal level regulate water quality for drinking water. And so we have data on that. It's flawed and incomplete, but we nationally have data on the quality of water that comes out of community water systems, right, when it's leaving the treatment facility. But we don't have really any knowledge about everything else that matters about water security. We don't have knowledge about who has access to drinking water in an ongoing way. We don't have knowledge about the reliability of drinking water access, when access gets disrupted, for how long it gets disrupted. And, you know, the HWISE network is starting to, you know, is working in this area, and that work is so important. But to me, it's really stunning, right, that we've never thought to build a regulatory structure to measure these things, right? We measure it very carefully for electricity, right? We know a lot about power outages and when they happen and how long they last, but we don't even have the starting point of knowing who gets served with drinking water, you know, whether it's through private wells or through a connection to some kind of community water system. And I think that is reflecting the fact that those who have been shut out, their voices were never part of the conversation, right? And so to me, like, that's the most pressing issue that's not commonly addressed. Certainly in policy, we can't have a good sense of climate-related risks when we don't even have sort of a baseline of access, of knowledge about access. And we can't measure, right, what the disruptions mean. And so there are folks who are starting to measure it. I've been working with, Emily Bell and Kat Otero, have started to analyze news data, right, local newspaper coverage on service outages in North Carolina, right, to try to get a sense of, you know, when do people lose access to drinking water, and how long does that last? And we're finding that it's overwhelmingly tied to storms, right? So this is climate-related impacts on drinking water access, but that draws attention, right, to the importance of local newspapers, right, as sources of information on water service. We've seen in the United States, right, that journalism is an important medium for drawing attention to water service disruption, right, in places like West Virginia, in Jackson, Mississippi, right? It's attracted national attention to water shortages, you know, water insecurity. But that news coverage, right, is variable across communities, and everywhere it's on the decline. And so, but that's the kind of place where we have to go to try to understand these things, because we don't have a regulatory structure in place to understand water access and water reliability in a setting, right, with a pretty well-developed state capacity, right? And yet still we're not measuring the kind of foundational things that we would need to know in order to understand water insecurity.
Yeah, I really take that to heart, because I think what we have relied on, at least in the narrative in the water management and sector, is that, well, we have universal coverage in the US. It was never really identified as an issue. Yet, of course, existing recent research, and this is obviously where I sort of work as well, is to really highlight those issues around reliability, affordability, accessibility, et cetera. And adding on to it, as we all know, at least in the US, the freeze in Texas. I can't tell you how many people were approaching our institute to discuss the question of like, well, how did this happen? And how many people were impacted? And I think Megan just said what I said is we don't know, because there, in terms of what do we not have, or it's not commonly addressed, at least in the science policy realm, is information, at least in the US. So just to underscore really, Megan, what you said. Amanda, what are your thoughts on this? What are we not addressing when it comes to water disruption or climate disruptions and water insecurity?
Yeah, I think Megan framed it really well, that we don't know these things because we're not collecting the data, and the data we are collecting comes with those embedded assumptions, right? And so when I thought about this question, this is kind of like the hill I die on in terms of the lack of attention on small systems and self-supplying households. Like, if you are under 15 connections, we don't even know how many of you there are in the country. They're not regulated even for water quality. So let alone the data issues around the larger systems that are regulated, these small systems and the domestic wells, or even small little intakes, I think there is growing attention, but because the data isn't there, I think researchers kind of replicate the way the data is structured. And so you have a lot of political scientists and public admin researchers that will just slice off a certain size of systems because the data is not reliable or it's not there. And I think that what that means is, like, we have a arguably highly vulnerable set of water institutions, at least in the US, that are not properly understood and are arguably the first to be impacted. And I think the other thing that makes me think about is that what to me is compelling about small systems is that it opens up a different solution set. And so because there has been such a focus on large urban suppliers, or what that means, you end up thinking about large desal, large recycled regionalization. And I think that, and I think this work is much more developed in the global South. Like, how do you do distributed water infrastructure? How do you do water sharing? How do you do these more nimble, flexible, adaptive infrastructure, political, managerial solutions that I think is what's really going to be necessary to be more responsive to these fast events, slow events, because everything is much more variable. I think somebody described like the Metropolitan Water District. I mean, they're pretty adaptive in California, but it's like steering a cruise ship. So the time it takes for a large urban supplier to adapt, to innovate, is like a 20, 30-year head start. And so I think that if we, as researchers and scholars, especially within the policy community, focus more on these first impacted smaller systems, learn from the Global South scholarship and the solution sets that exist there, I think we might be setting ourselves up for different kinds of success into the future.
Yeah, I totally understand, Amanda. I think that really targets a couple dynamics that actually speak to some of the things that Farhana has done, and I'll jump to her in a second, but I do want to insert this issue about flexibility and adaptation demands that you actually have a labor force that can do it. And one of the things that we see within the water sector is, in fact, a gutting out of the labor force of people who do the work of water. And so one of the things in my mind when we talk about adaptation, we talk about and I really like this notion of a different solution set when you focus in on the small water systems. Below 3,300 connections is like the magic number. Right, that then I think highlights the fact that we just don't have the labor and knowledge pool to be able to pull this off. So even if you have these regulations, in some of the work that my students have done, the capacity isn't yet there. And so maybe that can focus resources on how do these smaller water systems and even self-service systems, how do we build that capacity in? And that I don't think is something that has yet taken off, but certainly in the context of climate disruption. And there's of course a gender dimension if we want to look at the water sector as well, that Farhana really has taken on and really looked at these issues. So without further ado, just to add that in there. So Farhana then, and you come at this from, you know, in terms of your research, non-US based, although of course the insights are certainly ones that we can incorporate in our own analyses in the US. What do you see as the key issues or topics or themes that climate disruption and water insecurity in terms of science policy need to address?
Sure. So as you pointed out, I don't work so much within the US context. I do a little bit, but more so internationally. So let me bring in some insights from the Global South, because that's where largely my work is based. So I think first thing is that even though climate change has been framed as like a global problem for all humanity, we know that there's a lot of heterogeneity and unevenness, right, in its manifestation and the impacts and responses, or the capacity to respond, or the adaptive capability. So we need to kind of recognize who is the global we, or the royal us, and kind of nuance that. I think that's something that's often missing in global discussions. And I think that nuance is slowly filtering in because of some of the pushback in terms of, no, we're not all in the same boat. Some of us are drowning. Some of us were never on the boat. Similarly, you'll find also discourses around, you know, affecting the poor uniformly across the Global South. That is partially true, but it's obviously further complicated by power relations that are intersectional by gender, ethnicity, caste, and so on. So when we think about, you know, who are the global poor, who climate disruptions and water injustices have impacted the most and longstanding, they're also the ones who have contributed the least to climate change in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, or even negotiation power in policy realms at the international scale, and often even in their own nation states at the federal level, or even at the regional level. So when we think about issues around livelihood, survival, poverty, we need to look at like how these are, you know, wrapped up in these broader conversations of language and framing. So discourse matters, and on also why context matters. Because when we talk about, you know, so my work has really been influenced a lot by, you know, critical feminist scholarship. So when I'm talking about intersectionality, it's absolutely essential to recognize this as contextual. So we have to address the oppressions that are occurring contextually in order to be able to uplift people intersectionally. Otherwise, it doesn't apply. So if you're going to always have, you know, a racial perspective, that works most in settler colonial contexts, such as the US. But if you're working in a relatively ethnically homogeneous society, you'll probably find that gender and class or caste differences or migrant status are much more relevant or much more oppressive. Globally, there's that racialization, right? But I'm talking about local context. So bringing this back to how we think about issues and frame it, what I've really found is that feminist analysis, or the insights from feminist work for over decades, has largely been overlooked in talking about, you know, science and policy, or even in terms of planning around climate disruptions. If we want to think about overall well-being and justice, I think some of those insights are really important. So for instance, a pressing issue across South Asia has been looking at how climate disruptions and water crises, whether they're slow onset or rapid, you know, or first, what was the word you used, first order, second order, you know, these intersectional gender relations impact livelihood opportunities of entire households. It also impacts, you know, vulnerabilities and hardships that are intergenerational, survival capacities. So we kind of need a little bit more of a better comprehensive understanding of the way climate change is impacting households and communities through water. So I'll give a quick example. So when we think about like water stress or water insecurity, they are compounding across large sectors of the Global South, whether it's Latin America, Africa, Asia. We're seeing many impoverished women and girls spending disproportionate amounts of labor, time, and energy in terms of fetching household water. So to ensure household or even communal level water security, when there's no ready connection or availability, you have like this kind of gendered division of labor because of, you know, patriarchal norms or histories of misogyny which exist everywhere. So I mean, I love it when my students are like, well, we don't have that problem in America. And I ask them to think, well, in your grandfather's generation, right? Or who did the laundry, who went down the water well or to the river, or even in your house right now, is it your mother nagging you about laundry? If you have a, heteropatriarchal household, that is. So, when we think about like how domestic water is seen as a feminized task, whereas irrigation is seen as a masculine task, even in America, men doing, the yard work, women are doing the gardening. So there's that kind of, feminization, and we need to think about femininities and masculinities as they operate in ecological work, right? Ecological care work, but then also in terms of experiencing ecological breakdown. So when we think about like, different institutional barriers being in place, different access issues, different, socially constructed oppressions, whether gender and class, gender and race, or class and race, and so on, we need to think about how household water connection is important, but it doesn't necessarily mean like, issues of reliability, timing, affordability, and all of that. But when this is not available, or when there's no regulatory frameworks or lack of governance that is equitable, you do see impoverished communities where poorer women and girls are spending huge amounts of effort and time when publicly accessible sources are not viable. That makes it harder. If the source is malfunctioning or shut down, or socially made inaccessible, or financially made unaffordable, water insecurity is experienced in more heightened ways across gender lines, but the implications are across households and communities in terms of health, nutrition, well-being, and so on. Educational opportunities, work opportunities. Conversely, what I've also found in my research is that as climate is driving more water stresses, whether it's through salinity intrusion of aquifers or flooding, as we've been seeing more recently around the world, these kind of gender domestic responsibilities are also leading to gender-based violence, or entire households not being able to address their water needs, both productive and social, reproductive and productive. And this reinforces their vulnerabilities in their ability to respond to and cope with other types of climate disruptions. For instance, wildfires or air quality, or, issues around, for instance, what we've been seeing is like the flash floods, right? And entire towns going under, like what happens? And then related to my more recent work over the last year and a half related to the COVID-19 pandemic, what was the first, policy mandate? Wash hands, socially distance. If you don't have water, you can't wash hands. So hygiene and hand washing was severely, became a problem or a challenge, which then compounded those gendered and classed responsibilities in terms of obtaining enough water to deal with the pandemic and a public health crisis. So when we're thinking about how climate change is impacting like quality and quantity and availability, seasonality of waterscapes that are changing, we need to also therefore think about, how are we understanding the word gender? And I'll end on this point really briefly, so it'll be a little bit reductionist, because it's not only just women and girls, right? Because gender, men and boys have gender too. So how is gender being understood in the policy world? Again, going back to the framing issue, how is it being applied? Because the dominant focus has been on women. Okay, granted that this is a group across societies that has experienced these kinds of ecological breakdowns more because of various forms of gender division of labor, but then also in terms of opportunities and so on. And obviously, there are relational axes of oppression by class, by race, by age. So when we think about the importance of inclusion and equality that is often in the rhetoric of policymaking and planning, we need to therefore not romanticize women, or not romanticize women's knowledge or women's participation in climate change mitigation, climate adaptation, or water governance programs, but to recognize those differentiated and constrained roles, responsibilities, and opportunities. So we need to think about inclusion without essentialization. And this is difficult. It's not easy, but it's a really important messaging that I think we need to constantly keep at the mind, in our minds. So while historically meaning the last couple of decades, where gender became important in policymaking, marginalized women, identities of women as a group became important, but then this also has to be recognized to be, intersectionality, involving its intersectionality, so understanding how masculinities and femininities are constructed, negotiated, altered, and transformed through climate change impacts. And finally, I think one thing that's often missed out is that we need to recognize the kind of the spatial vulnerability that is a historical outcome of processes of, geopolitical factors, ongoing, racial capitalism, historical colonialism, imperialism, and how that influences global institutions that govern climate financing, water programming, infrastructure plans, and how therefore that affects different contexts. So, we need to think about, we can talk about like frequency and duration and timing and intensity of things like floods and storms or droughts and desertification. But then what happens with the institutions that are then, brought in to deal with these? Are they reproducing ongoing oppressions or creating new ones? Are they undertaking a justice-oriented approach to deal with multiple forms of vulnerabilities, or are they continuing legacies of silencing and othering or marginalization that don't really help uplift a whole bunch of people? Again, I'll stop there so we can continue our conversation.
No, thank you, Farhana. And I also want to just do a quick sidebar to our attendees. If you have any questions, just throw those in the chat, and then I will bring them to our panel as well. So that's been kind of silent. Maybe y'all are shy, but don't be. We'll get to you if you throw some good questions in there for us, or any questions really. I'm sure they're all good. This thing makes me think, and I'm gonna throw a curveball to the panelists. I got a few prompts, and I'm gonna go to prompt 3 actually, because I'm thinking about, on the one hand, we in this conversation have seemed to sort of say, okay, there's like the U.S. context and global South context, but I would want to throw out there that in the context of climate disruption, entire systems are being destroyed, right? So if we look at the fires in California, it destroys the actual infrastructure itself. Salinization, especially seawater intrusion, over time destroys our already aging infrastructure. So this idea that our infrastructure is solid, or our institutions are going to continue in the future under current climate disruption. I want to sort of question that, and I'm looking to Megan because of the work that you've done with on water institutions, obviously climate-related water risk, with and fragmented institutions. Like how institutionally robust are our systems in order to even adapt to these climate disruptions, since it's at the foundation of infrastructure that they are really being eroded? And how do you see that moving forward in terms of what are the ways institutions and communities can adapt to these very considerable disruptions? Again, it's not simply not having, electricity for the pumps for 3 days as we did in Texas, but fires that destroy entire systems. And what is our capacity? So I'm gonna go to Megan on that. And I'm sorry I'm putting you on the spot there, but what are your thoughts?
It's a great question. And I've been thinking, since Amanda said, the different solution sets, right? These small systems require these different solution sets, and everything that we've been talking about since then, that phrase keeps resonating in my mind. Institutions in the United States, formal institutions in the United States, move very slowly, and they change through layering, right? We rarely throw out the old, we just layer more and more on top of one another. And we see this in a particularly pronounced way in water governance, where we just have layers and layers and layers of complex formal authority overlying, of course, many layers of informal authority. The change in the undercurrents of those institutions, right? The partisan polarization, the kind of saturation of partisanship through all kind of social and economic dimensions of American political life has, in contrast, been quite rapid. Really, kind of unfolding quite quickly over a few decades. And what that means for our institutions, our formal institutions going forward, when it's compounded, right, by these climate risks, right, when it's compounded by just, economic inequality that's kind of spiraling out of control, is a fair question, right? Will we see faster institutional change at the formal level than we have in the past? I'm not sure. I'm hesitant to say that I anticipate that, right? I kind of expect, because of the way our institutions historically have changed so slowly and have embedded, right, structures of power and perpetuated those structures of power to the point where they are a mismatch to the population so strongly. It makes me think that that's going to continue to be slow moving. But to bring that, to go back to Amanda's kind of alternative solution set and think about it in the context of some of what Farhana has been talking about, right? This water workforce that you mentioned, the local public officials who were making decisions about water and about resilience in local communities are overwhelmingly male. Like the gender disparity in the United States among those two groups of people is kind of unbelievable, right? I mean, for local elected officials, as far as we know, there's probably 80% plus are male, right? And the water workforce, it wouldn't surprise me if the numbers are the same. And so what does that mean for the kinds of how we approach these alternative solution sets? Most of the alternative solutions that I think of introduce some amount of dependence, right? Interdependence among communities, right? Various ways of interconnecting the physical infrastructure of systems, right? So that when, you're starting to get saltwater intrusion, when your pipes are becoming less safe, you have sort of, a backup plan, building in various forms of financial cross-subsidization to help, right, soldier up the revenue base for these systems that can't support their own infrastructure. Consolidation, right, when a system is really struggling. All these sort of forms of, even just, regional collaboration around source water protection. They all introduce different kinds of interdependence. And, I'm speaking completely outside my expertise now, but it is some of the resistance. I do, within my expertise is solid knowledge that there is strong community resistance to that kind of interdependence. That kind of interdependence makes localities nervous. They view it as a political risk. They view it as a water security risk because they know agreements can fail and they don't want to be stuck. Is there some relationship to who's making the decisions, right? And the gendered identity of who's making those decisions? That I don't know. I think it would be a great area of research within the US political context, bringing that lens to kind of community decision-making and bringing it into the US setting.
Yeah, Megan, what you say really resonates. I see my student Victoria Harrington is on, and her thesis interviewed small water system managers. And one of the interesting outcomes of that was to discover that system interdependence, I think, is something people are resisting, but they also have their own community that they create, which is very masculine and also white in the context of Texas too. So you have sort of both a racialized and gendered set of authorities that, as you say, when I use the term authority, I use it in the broad sense that they make decisions over how stuff works, and so that in terms of capacity to adapt to climate disruptions needs to be understood through that filter, and highlighting it, I think, is the first way to get to what Amanda said, which is that solution set as well. So we see that tension in the empirical work too. So I'm glad that that's something that I would underscore as well, needs more work on, but clearly, and if we look in the context of water management broadly, it's still very male. Irrigation, not just in the US, but broadly in the global South context and rural context. So the real questions of intersectionality that Farhana really underscores, I think we need to take those on board at all these different levels within the water institutions, whether it's in the US or in where Farhana works in South Asia. And actually speaking to that, I see there's a question. So Imran Khalid, thank you so much for your question. I'm going to read this to the panelists and see who wants to jump in. So here's the question. How do the panelists perceive the discussion around decentralization of assets and institutions, especially as climate change takes hold? Are there any areas of convergence vis-a-vis decentralized systems in terms of the global South and global North? So, anyone want to jump on that? Amanda.
Well, I just want to sort of link what Megan said to what this question is. I think, and this is clearly coming from a California context, but this idea of local control, if you look at SGMA, which is a big groundwater reform in California, that is an example of institutional change over the long term. They have to be sustainable by 2045. And if you look at the work of Kristen Doba and Erlinda Mendez-Barrientos, it's really clearly highlighting the ways in which local control of who's making decisions, who wrote the law, who already manages water, reinforces these power dynamics. And it speaks to Megan's point about resistance to consolidation, to regionalization. But the challenge, I think, is that like the way that water is managed currently, 50,000 water systems in the US, that to me is decentralized governance, and that is what local control is all about. And so there's going to be some sort of hybrid system where you might have regional political arrangements, ties, and trust to have like trustworthy water sharing, but physical separation or physical sort of decentralization. So I think there has to be some sort of meeting in the middle so that you don't have these, I think it's like the cabal of old white men water managers making decisions for the rest of us, because who's going to benefit from their decisions, which is what's been happening for years now. So I think what I will also say is that if you look at the water justice leaders, if you look at environmental justice leaders, they are predominantly women, they're mothers. And so if the solution set can be those that are identified from the movements, from the organizers, and from these female-led organizations, I think that could offer some hope, at least, to not just keep reinventing the wheel and perpetuating sort of the inequalities that the current decentralized way of doing things in the US have manifested.
Thank you, Amanda. Anyone else want to respond to Imran's question?
I can just add in a quick point, largely perhaps again from the Global South perspective as a kind of comparative contrast to what Amanda was saying. So, what do we mean by decentralization, and for whom and where? Because the, international development discourse around decentralization has been occurring for at least 2 or 3 decades, right? That we need more decentralized governance of whatever. But the whole thing is we need to therefore also think about capacity, but then also I come back to the framing because discourses become material realities. So when we think about these systems, whether it's climate adaptation or water governance, a lot of this has been depoliticized imperatives where things are rendered technical. So it's decentralized along different technicalities and technocentric managerialistic approaches. And these have been the dominant ways where, it's still sort of top-down planning and powerful people are making decisions, but then it's sort of decentralized and those kind of vertical patron-client, connections are maintained, whether it's national, local, or even international. And this is where I think one of those issues that we need to kind of think about, where's the role of the state, about different institutions at different scales, because we're decentralizing what? The state, but we're also, kind of retrenching power kind of vertically in terms of international donors, international NGOs, and so on. But there's been recent shifts in thinking about, okay, what do we mean by, you know, structural change that needs to happen? How do we work with local groups and leaders and local organizations? But at the same time, paying attention to local dynamics to see who's excluded or left out. And I think this is where a lot of the contribution from, you know, critical development geographers, feminist scholars became really imperative since the 1990s in terms of, you know, the critiques of discourses of community and participation and empowerment, because we're decentralizing to achieve what goals? It's often community-based, participatory, empowered something. So there are all these words. So it's like these buzzwords, and what does it mean? Like, how do we not essentialize or homogenize? How do we not impose externally determined matrices of success? How do we deal with the normative assumptions, you know, or the kind of the way things are made kind of technical or technological, devoid of the political process? So for instance, I've seen so many instances of this is decentralized local water retention dam without any cognizance of how this is impacting watersheds downstream, or coastal embankment plants that are great locally but are creating waterlogging problems, you know, which are intersectionally classed experiences where informal settlements are, you know, literally drowned out when there's water logging. So when we think about these issues around, you know, long-term capacity building of institutions and policies, I think it's really important to also think about social safety nets, and then constantly come back to, you know, who is being left out, who's being heard, what is going on and why, and going, you know, ending on the point on masculinization. I mean, I think I feel like a broken record after saying this for so long, that masculine bias still remains, you know, in terms of information access, employment opportunities, institutional arrangements, decision-making powers. But these occur internationally, globally, at the macro level, you know, whether it's to the World Bank, you know, the IMF, you know, but then they kind of collide with micro level, you know, power structures and power relations. And this plays out, therefore, in the water sector, in disaster management and climate mitigation or climate adaptation. So we're seeing that we need to, there's more discourse in engaging historically marginalized or historically oppressed groups. It's a question of like, how has that become a tick box issue in terms of just getting through it, or just really reductive consultation without really inclusive involvement of differently marginalized groups in public decision-making on long-standing issues that impact their lives. And I think this is why that kind of careful critical research and collaboration is so important, because this is how you then speak truth to power. And then therefore that forces, you know, discursive changes and material realities of how things are done and what is prioritized and what is not. So I think, yes, we need the data, we need to understand it, but we need to keep having these conversations. Otherwise, this decentralization itself as a normative goal and a term ends up being the end all and be all without much, you know, gain in terms of justice and well-being.
Excellent, thank you, Farhana. Megan.
Yeah, just thematically on point with what Farhana just said, and in the US context, I want to point everybody to work by Danielle Purifoy and Louise Seamster on creative extraction and the extractive relationships of dependency between Black towns and surrounding white communities, and the way that water and water infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure services are sort of strategically and exploitatively and not extended to different communities, and the way that Black communities' resources get extracted for the service of surrounding white towns, and how water gets caught up in that is, you know, an ongoing process in the US South and in other parts of the United States as well, in patterns that I think are quite consonant with what Farhana was just talking about in the global South.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And I predicted this when I talked with Amanda earlier today, because she's in my office suite right now, is with me, that we would talk and then we would get to 12 and it would go by really quickly. And it has. We are beyond top of the hour. We're at 12:05 Central Standard Time, wherever you are. We're at the top of the hour, just past. So with that, I wanted to provide an opportunity for each one of you to have some final thoughts, and however you want to frame those on this this challenge that we face, which is increasing intensity of climate disruptions, the diversity with which it's going to impact our water systems in our communities and households, and what we need to think about moving forward, and pushing not just our conversation, but policy and research forward. So I'm going to go to each one of you and have final thoughts on that. So Amanda, what are your thoughts? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, my final thought is somebody that's about to become embedded in or part of the state. I think it's, as long as this conversation can keep going, I think it'll help us keep the state accountable, whatever the state means. Because I think one of the things I've found through my work is that vulnerabilities are teleconnected, the adaptation solutions are teleconnected, and decisions in one place impact the other clearly. And so I think the challenge is also so large that hoping for the individual, for the household, the community level to figure it out themselves, I just think it's unfair and it replicates a lot of the climate injustices. And so I think the extent to which maybe people like me or others become part of the state, shift the state, take over the state, whatever that means, I think that that's the one way forward that I see in terms of trying to address some of the things we've talked about today.
Thank you, Amanda. Farhana.
All right, I think, well, I've said a lot already, but maybe I'll just end on the importance of kind of that continued work on building solidarity and agency and collectivities against different forms of systemic inequities and oppression, whether it's in the global north or global south, because then, and it means that an inclusive or an intentional effort, there's an intentionality involved, because otherwise we're not going to have even the remote hope or possibility of exploring, different strategies of resistance or emancipatory transformations. And we can do that through whether it's better policymaking, project planning, whether to reduce climate-related vulnerabilities, whether that's mitigation, fossil fuel divestment, and so on, but then also long-term commitments of institutions to address those systemic injustices. And often this gets caught up in a lot of conversations about mutuality, aid, care, respect, and all of that. And these are really important. But I think a part of that is also, how is that work being informed? Who is it helping? What are the barriers that exist institutionally and structurally, whether it's related more towards water-related issues, more towards climate, or the combination thereof. And I think one of the issues that is important, at least for academics, those who are listening in, and those of us here, is that continual investigation to expose these issues, to understand these interconnected injustices, these intersectional oppressions, so that we can think of what does successful adaptation look like? What does a justice-oriented outcome mean? We need to think about, like, who is deciding, for whom is it being decided, in what ways is it being planned, why, how is it financed, how is it being executed, is there monitoring and evaluation, follow-up? So this therefore calls for accountability and transparency and monitoring, which often is where things fail, right? Things are done and people leave. And you need to therefore build in those budgetary resources and, personnel capacities, and continuing leadership, or rather continuing education, so that there is that collaboration between academic research, implementation, policymaking, so that we can, continue to learn and grow, and therefore improve the institutions that impact everyday life for people everywhere. And without kind of romanticizing the power of institutions, thinking about scale and space and all of that geographers do. So I think that, we need to think about power relations across sites and scale, but then also contextual issues. So, I think this is the only way that we can really start to foster addressing in more comprehensive ways what we mean by, overcoming or repairing climate disruption and water insecurity and water crises.
Thank you so much, Farhana. And Megan, last word, last thoughts.
So in a system of biased and unrepresentative power relationships, right, where people making decisions that can reduce risk, right, and that can help equalize access to water security, if we sit in that setting right now, can we understand better the risks that decision makers perceive in reducing risks, right? So we think a lot about the climate related risks to water and how those risks get distributed, whether we can measure those or not. But I think we don't think enough about the risks that decision makers are perceiving in doing something about it, right? How are they perceiving the political risks? How are they receiving the economic risks? How are they perceiving the sort of risks that a deal can fall apart? Why aren't they cooperating? Why aren't they trusting, right, the other actors in the setting? Can we understand that set of risks a bit better so that we can design governing and financial structures that motivate decisions we want, even in a setting where the people making the decisions aren't necessarily the people we would like to be having the decisions, right? Because I'm feeling an urgency. I guess that's where I end up. I'm feeling an urgency to get better decisions within our current structures while we change those structures. Mm-hmm. And so can we do some incremental institutional layering to get marginally better decisions right now while we change those structures?
Yes, Megan, I call it the pragmatist revolutionary approach to addressing these issues and inequities within the water system. And on that both hopeful and urgent note, I do want to thank everybody who has attended, to our panelists for the efforts and time and thoughts that they've shared with us today. It's great to see everyone, and watch this space, watch our social media. We are going to be amplifying more of our HWISE Now gatherings, and hopefully this moment, this hour was a great time for us to share these new ideas and inspire those of us who are really committed to working in this space for change now and for change in the future around water justice and climate justice. So thank you all for joining us today. And so with that, I'm going to stop the recording and again, just thank all of you. Thank you so much.